This is our program for the week of May 12th, 2025. Last week, we held our PSA as a court hearing was taking place for Rumeysa Ozturk. She was freed from detention during our PSA last Friday, just a week or so after Mohsen Madawi. And just yesterday, Badr Khan Suri, the Georgetown professor and Indian national, whom you may remember DHS accused of, quote, actively spreading Hamas propaganda and promoting anti-Semitism, was also released from detention as well just yesterday. While Mahmoud Khalil remains in custody, these are notable victories for the solidarity movement against the political targeting of activists. Meanwhile, students and organizers have been active in keeping the focus on the dire situation in Gaza. Students across California state universities have been on hunger strike to protest Israel's blockade of food and water into Gaza and the Israeli enforced famine against the Palestinian people. In the current climate of political repression against Palestine solidarity, these demonstrations are not only brave, but essential to keeping the U.S. public engaged around the atrocities waged against Gaza, and a reminder that these campaigns are, there are other campaigns rather, seeking increased solidarity activism for Sudan, Haiti, and many other places resisting the boot of imperialism. And while there remains a dizzying array of political fronts against fascism, imperialism, and worker exploitation across the US right now, it's worth highlighting the steady work of these students and activists who've remained steadfast in their efforts to speak despite the political risks. Speaking of that steadfast activism, just yesterday, friend of the PSA and Rutgers law professor Noura Erakat was again before a UN body, synthesizing the political conditions and the task before the so-called international order. Her full remarks are always worth checking out, but we want to play a short clip from her address at the UN on the commemoration of the 77th anniversary of the Nakba.
The Nakba is ongoing, and so is Palestinian resistance to our elimination. There is sufficient law to end the genocide, to lift the blockade, to end the occupation, and to realize Palestinian self-determination. Had international law ever been enough, however, Palestinian refugees would be growing their families and their gardens on their original lands rather than searching for the remains of flesh of their babies beneath the rubble. Remarkably, the time of genocide has also been a moment of significant judicial strides furthering Palestinian liberation. In January 2024, the International Court of Justice determined that Israel's campaign was plausible genocide. In May 2024, it issued another provisional measure ordering the withdrawal from Rafah. That same month, the International Criminal Court finally issued arrest warrants for Benjamin Netanyahu and Yoav Gallant. In July 2024, the ICJ issued an advisory opinion determining that Israel's presence in the West Bank and Gaza is unlawful, ordering it to withdraw its settlers and military from the territory and to provide reparations for the Palestinian people. Last month, the ICJ heard an argument on the legality of banning UNRWA, the UN refugee agency responsible for humanitarian relief, and now banned amid a starvation campaign that has killed 57 children in 2 months. This is not a legal controversy. It is a political one. The United States, among other states, has wrung its hands behind judicial rulings, but this is selective deference to the court. In its last days of office, the Biden administration recognized there's a genocide of the Masalit ethnic tribe in Darfur by the Rapid Support Forces. When asked whether they can use the same standards to make that decision to adjudicate Israel's campaign in Gaza, the U.S. Ambassador at Large for Global Criminal Justice said, quote, "It will ultimately be for the ICJ judges to decide with zero irony that they did not have to submit their evidence on the Sudan before the ICJ. This is not a legal controversy. This is a political one. The selective deference to the ICJ on the question of genocide of Palestinians is an attempt to deflect responsibility, and the ongoing counter-revolution against activists globally is an attempt to revise a history of the present. Since 2020, an emerging consensus among legacy human rights organizations and the World Court have defined Israel as an apartheid regime. Rather then boycott, divest from, and sanction apartheid Israel, the global community has attempted to normalize it. 5 years later, we see the danger of allowing that exception. Apartheid and genocide are on the same continuum. The three of the specific acts conducted to maintain apartheid are identical to the acts committed to commit genocide. In the former, for apartheid, they are done for the purpose of domination. In the latter, they are done with the intent to destroy. Genocide is the logical outcome of any project to conquer and settle the land upon which and other people live, unless it is checked. Many of you here, many of you, have either survived colonialism or are the ancestors of those who have survived colonialism, and you are painfully aware of its legacies. That's why in 1974, this body firmly resolved that Palestinians are a juridical people. Palestinians exist and deserve to exist by relegating Palestine to a bilateral political issue beyond the reach of international norms. You have steadily normalized occupation. By failing to apply sanctions and engage in boycott, many of you have normalized apartheid. And now, by failing to act, you are at risk of normalizing genocide. But if you normalize genocide, you will have nothing left.
Samar, Noura's always been so effective at pressing humanity's case before the UN on behalf of Palestine, often indicating the failures and hypocrisies of the international order while identifying the choices that are still available to advance human rights. And I can imagine it may feel or seem symbolic given the obvious abdication of duties that all of us have witnessed over the last several months and the last year plus at the international level. But I find that these missives have important value both in the current moment and historically because she's often grounding us in the political history of Palestine and its relevance to the current material conditions that we're experiencing, which is quite the opposite of what we experience reading headlines in Western media, which are often structured to make it seem like what's happening now is somehow new or otherwise isolated from everything that's accumulated up until this moment. I'm wondering about your reflections just on, as we reach another milestone, another Nakba anniversary, on Noura's comments and also, where we are at the international level, dealing with international action on Palestine as so much continues to happen that warrants international action, particularly the conditions of famine that you've been reporting on for the last several weeks.
Yeah, what a fresh horror show in an unending cavalcade of horror shows over the past year and a half. But yeah, of course, I totally agree with you. It can often feel like, bearing witness in that way doesn't really do anything, but it does in the long arc of things, right? And one of the things that I always have appreciated about Noura is her sort of strategic orientation towards long-term systemic change. And part of that is, being on the record, holding people to account, even when that doesn't produce like an immediate tangible output, right? Like success and victory are not the same things. We're moving forward in ways that may not feel so apparent. And that's the thing that I always try to reflect on. I sat a lot in my feelings yesterday for this 77th anniversary, of the Nakba and this new Nakba that Palestine is facing and its new untold horrors. And on how different everything feels, even just from a year ago, right? Even just from the end of last year, how quickly things are changing and how quickly we have to adapt to those changes, right? That like, that dialectic analysis requires us to sort of ensure that we're producing the commensurate response to the situation that's being produced in that moment. And here we are in a wholly new moment, and it is time once again for us to reassess our strategies and think about how we can make sure that we're making the impacts that we want to make. So, you know, these times of crisis always call for reflection and change. So I don't know. I'm just glad to be in it with you all, I guess.
Yeah, and I appreciate also what we're doing here to kind of keep things on the record as well. And again, another week full of lots of updates on lots of fronts and a very rapidly shifting set of conditions in the Middle East surrounding Palestine as well, which I'm sure you'll keep us up to date on as well. So, with that, great to see you again, comrade, and the floor is yours.
Thanks, Thomas. And yeah, what a week. What a whiplash week of Middle East developments. Starting as we always do on the situation in Gaza, you know, the as I'm sure folks saw, the attacks by the Israeli military on Gaza this week were some of the worst in the history of this like latest phase of the genocide. So since 2023, literally these last 3 days have seen a massive increase in attacks and bombardments. So clearly in response, by the way, to the Idan Alexander release, but we'll come back to that. And meanwhile, in the context of that violence, of course, we're seeing uh, acute food insecurity on a level at this point unprecedented. So even before the ceasefire at the end of last year, we're now seeing a situation that's just as bad, if not
We now
worse.
turn to our
And so the
last
official
speaker.
classifications now report that there are zero people in Gaza who are not food insecure, which means literally every single one of the 2 million people present in the Gaza Strip, or however many are still there, um, a very lucky 7% happen to exist below the crisis point. They're just food insecure. They're not at the crisis point, and the remaining 93% are at crisis or above, with 12% fully in famine at this point. So we're talking about hundreds of thousands of people who are currently experiencing famine. And just to dig into both of these pieces, the military assaults and this forced starvation campaign. On the military side, what we saw is really just 3 days in a row of absolutely horrific bombings. The first on the 14th, and then yesterday on the 15th, of course, and then just today, another round of bombings that, the articles here don't reflect that, but something like 140 or 150 more people have been killed just in the past 24 hours from a new round of aggressive bombings and armed incursions. So this idea of the Israeli new plan of conquering Gaza, which is sort of on hold until Trump's Middle East visit ends, might actually be starting now. So we might be seeing the very beginnings of that offensive. So, this idea that, Netanyahu is now saying very explicitly that within the next few days, uh, the new Gaza operation will commence with, quote, full force, which, again, is hard to imagine given everything that's already happened so far. But, the usual sort of bombastic bluster about, we're going to go in and we're going to fully eradicate Hamas, while also, as confirmed by Mark Warner, who's a Democratic senator from Virginia, the Israeli intelligence is telling the United States government that they know that they are not, in fact, going to be able to eradicate Hamas. So once again, the idea of like the thing that they're selling on the national or international stage is totally disconnected from any sense of reality, even their own political and strategic assessments of what they're doing in Gaza. So, you know, it's annihilation, right? As it has been from the beginning. And a big part of that, a big part of the overall strategic orientation of the Israeli state and Israeli military right now is, of course, this forced starvation campaign. Um, and as we saw on the first slide, like the extent of that food insecurity is now fully in crisis mode. Where the expectation is that the majority of people in Gaza will be in full famine within the next few months. And it's worth noting that even if some sort of deal comes together in the next few days, which it won't, but even if it did, it takes time for like the logistical and distribution apparatuses to be rebuilt, and the like transportation and distribution of humanitarian assistance, like that takes days, if not weeks. And so, to prevent that widespread famine from happening, something has to happen basically today, and that's clearly not happening. Uh, And, despite once again Israel's official protestations that starvation is not an issue, they are admitting in private um, that like the Israeli security establishment basically has reached the same conclusions as most humanitarian aid organizations, and that's the New York Times saying that, so not exactly a friendly publication. The world is responding to this forced starvation campaign on some levels or others. We can see the United States, for example, where Marco Rubio is saying that he's troubled by the humanitarian situation, and even describing it as a humanitarian situation as opposed to what we're hearing even from like Israel's European allies who are calling it the deliberate blocking of aid. Humanitarian situation sort of makes it sound like it's a force of nature or like some unfortunate thing that has happened, as opposed to a deliberate plan that is currently being implemented and just needs to stop. Like Israelis need to stop the blockade and then all the aid can get in. But um, we did see some surprisingly strong language from European leaders this week, where Emmanuel Macron, who famously made all Palestine protests illegal in France, um, is saying that Europe is at a point now where it may have to consider its cooperation. We may have to reconsider its cooperation agreements with Israel, which is a really big deal. Like we're finally talking about the kind of sanctioning that Noura mentioned on that video call. Whether they'll actually do it or if it's just bluster is, of course, a different question. But he referred to himself as like he said, "My job is to do everything I can to make this humanitarian catastrophe stop." And that, he put the blame squarely on the Israeli government, which is not nothing. I don't know that he'll do anything with that, but like we are seeing an erosion of that sort of broad Western consensus around protecting Israel at all costs. And it'll take some time, I think, to see the dividends from that. But the fact that it exists, I do think is really important. In the context of all of that is, of course, this Gaza Humanitarian Foundation that we talked about last week. Um, this is confusingly not the Israeli distribution plan that we talked about a couple weeks ago, but is a U.S. plan that claims the Israelis are not involved, that for all intents and purposes mirrors more or less exactly the Israeli aid distribution plan. So it's not super clear to me where, but there are going to be four distribution sites, and those are like, the Israeli plan had all of them in Rafah. So it may well be the case that these will also be in Rafah. I don't know if it's been disclosed or not. I don't think it has. Um, but definitely most of it is going to be in Rafah. And this is, as we talked about last week, hugely condemned by the international humanitarian community, called out as like a thing that isn't following the protocols of the way that humanitarian aid is supposed to be distributed. And really to the point, if the Israeli military is embarking on this campaign of mass displacement, right? They're currently going in with this new plan to force all of Palestinians out of their homes into Rafah, is the stated plan, right? That's what's been written and approved by the cabinet. Um, the idea is to turn the rest of Gaza into a free-for-all kill zone, right? So any Gazans that aren't in Rafah are basically, could be killed for no reason by the Israeli military because those are now no-go zones. But if the U.S. is in fact putting its aid distribution sites in Rafah, you're basically baiting that forced displacement, right? You're saying if you want to eat, you have to agree to your displacement to this one area because that's the only place that you're going to get any sort of humanitarian aid. And so that obviously, again, goes against any international humanitarian law that exists. But here we are. They are now at the point of building these aid distribution sites for the Gaza Humanitarian Foundation. So it's looking like that plan will be operational sometime by the beginning of June or the end of May. It's also worth noting that even as it was described, the plan isn't really doing anything that will meaningfully reduce the risk of famine across Gaza. Like obviously any aid is needed, but the scale at which it's intended to operate really doesn't come anywhere close to dealing with the extent of food insecurity faced by 2 million people, obviously. So obvious, we're left with very little else but to think about this in the context of what it is, right? A broad campaign of genocide against the Palestinian people. And this deliberate starvation tactic is clearly one key pillar in that broader strategic orientation. And that's more or less what this, Tom Fletcher, who's the UN humanitarian chief, this week said, um, caught a lot of flack for using the word genocide. He's actually, I believe, the first UN official to use the word genocide to describe what's happening in Gaza. But it's worth noting that he actually didn't even necessarily accuse Israel of genocide, sort of. What he said was aid workers are trying to prevent genocide, sort of implying that it hasn't happened yet, but that, like, if the starvation policy continues, then it will be considered a genocide. And even that apparently was a bridge too far, of course, and he's being attacked left and right, including from the United States, for even daring to utter the word genocide. And meanwhile, outside of the political realm, a Dutch newspaper, reached out to a bunch of genocide scholars. Again, we talked about a similar thing that Vox did last year, I think, but this is an even broader set of people, um, basically asking them if what was happening in Gaza is genocide, and it's unanimous. Like literally all of them said, yes, it is a genocide. And these are, the chair of Holocaust studies at some European university, things like that. Um, and their contention is like it's not even close. It's not a controversial take. Like it is genocide. And that, their contention is that there isn't a single serious genocide scholar left in the world that isn't calling this genocide. And, even in the context of all of that, of course, right? Like the political circumstances are very different. Um, The other really big sort of Gaza development this week, of course, was the release of the final remaining Israeli American prisoner, Idan Alexander, who was a volunteer with the IDF that was captured on October 7th. Um, the story behind this is really fascinating, and we don't have time to get into all of the details here, so I do recommend checking out some of these articles, particularly the Axios one actually goes into a lot of the detail here. Um, and apparently, what happened was Hamas had reached out directly to what's the guy's name? Like Bisharat something. He's the guy who ran Arab Americans for Trump and basically did this like back channel negotiation um, with that person to try to build up some sort of direct line of communication with the Trump administration in order to see if they could work out some way of releasing that one hostage. The way that it played out, as far as I can understand it, is that Hamas was basically convinced by him, by the Arab Americans for Trump guy, and by whatever Trump administration officials he was talking to, that um, um, that they should give Idan Alexander to the United States, quote, for free, meaning not in exchange for any like explicit promises or anything. Um, and so, the idea being that that gesture of goodwill would be really critical in getting Trump to basically push for some sort of ceasefire. That doesn't seem to really be what happened at all, right? I mean, like obviously they did release him without any conditions, but here we are at the very end of, like Trump's trip through the Middle East and well, through the, Arabian Peninsula, and there isn't really any meaningful talk of a ceasefire as far as I can see. Nothing has materially changed per se about what's happening here. So it's hard to really know whether like what meaningfully will come from this, but there's a few different pieces here that are definitely worth talking about. Um, it's also, I feel like we need to see this as a sort of continuation of the a piece that we talked about months ago, where Adam Bowler, who was, at one point a very prominent Trump administration official who was talking to Hamas directly, and because he was engaged in direct negotiations with Hamas, was basically, pilloried and sidelined by the Republican establishment. Um, Now, there are new direct channels of communication, which obviously Israel is furious about. So, it's worth noting, though, of course, this week that Steve Witkoff, who apparently was in Israel meeting with hostage families while Trump has been puttering around the Arabian Peninsula, reportedly is like smearing Netanyahu behind his back, saying, well, smearing implies, libelous talk, which he's just telling the truth, which is that, Israel is not willing to end the war and that the United States wants to bring remaining hostages home, but Netanyahu is the one who's making it impossible, which like, yeah, I mean, that's clearly true. Um, so I mean, there's something there about like the frustration I think that the Trump administration is feeling about the way that Netanyahu is handling this whole thing, given particularly that Trump has his own regional ambitions here, and I think in many ways Netanyahu is probably getting in the way of them. So, last thing I just want to note about the Idan Alexander stuff, a couple of small things here. One, as a hostage and a person with hostage family stuff, like we can see this sort of increasing resentment towards Netanyahu. I saw some reporting that he refused to meet with Netanyahu, but I don't know whether that's true or not. What is definitely true is there's basically like a widespread PR campaign against this just freed Israeli hostage in Israel because they perceive him to not be like sufficiently deferential to Netanyahu. So just once again, like if we ever needed more evidence that the Israelis don't actually care about the hostages even a little bit, and the fact that they were incensed that these negotiations that led to his release even happened in the first place, right? I think tells you a lot. But also, um, I found this fascinating, this like Jerusalem Post article talking about how Idan Alexander was injured when a tunnel collapsed on him in captivity. Like, yeah, what does that mean? Like, it just happened, like a tunnel just collapsed on him for no reason, or as has been the case throughout this whole thing, the Israeli bombardment of Gaza is the thing that has endangered the hostages more than anything else. But, God forbid they say it that directly. Meanwhile, from this sort of expectation that Trump would do something on Gaza this week, I think we ended up in a situation where we're not really seeing much as far as that goes, right? Uh, there's this whole freedom zone thing that he was talking about this week, where uh, some people have referred to it as a departure from the Riviera plan, but it seems like it's the same thing. Basically, he's saying, I would still like the United States to control Gaza and turn it into a quote unquote freedom zone. So he doesn't seem to have really moved on this at all. It's not super surprising that his conversations with Gulf monarchs didn't make him like suddenly care about the plight of the Palestinian people, as some people were kind of bizarrely expecting. Um, yeah, so there's a lot there, obviously, and we'll loop back to some of like the Gulf state influence stuff that came out of this, but just to note that as this like hostage situation played out, and this like sort of soft promises that releasing the hostage would somehow resolve the overlying conflict in a way that it would allow for at least a temporary ceasefire. None of that seems to be materializing. It might still be happening. There are things that could be happening behind the scenes. But from what we see right now, it may just well be the case that, as he's done 8 million times before, Trump makes a promise and then doesn't do anything to actually fulfill it. Um, Moving over to the West Bank quickly, just a couple things to note. One, there's been a renewed round of Israeli attacks on the West Bank this week after a woman who lives in a settlement was shot on her way to a hospital. The way that like the framing of this New York Times article honestly broke my brain. Hamas celebrates shooting that killed Israeli mother is like, like, have they ever described Israeli bombings as like Israel celebrates, like killing of baby, even though that clearly happens all the time? Just the the callousness of the Western traditional media just like never ceases to surprise me. I don't know why I continue to be shocked by the depths to which they'll reach, but I do continue to be shocked somehow. Meanwhile, also worth noting that a Yemeni missile hit the West Bank this week. Well, it like sort of landed in a settlement, even though it was also intercepted. So the Yemeni campaign of attacking Israel does continue sort of unabated as expected, given that the so-called ceasefire agreement that they signed with Trump didn't have anything to do with Israel, and even Trump said that. And so here we go. We're not considering this to be a violation of that agreement because, as they said, they're going to continue to attack Israel, and they have been. Um, we talked a lot last week about what happened with this Yemen ceasefire. So folks aren't caught up. I would definitely recommend checking out last week's session. But a couple of new things that I think are really worth mentioning here. This New York Times article going over the sort of process by which they got to the point of Trump requiring the ceasefire, I think is absolutely fascinating. I would definitely give it a read, even though obviously, per usual, the framing is kind of nonsense. The content in it is still worth, sort of sitting with a little bit. Like mainly, they mentioned the fact that um, the U.S. military burned through $1 billion with a B in just the first month of the bombardment of Yemen. This was a 7-week campaign, so they effectively spent $2 billion. They lost 2 fighter planes, and they discovered that, like, despite having bombed Yemen this whole time, um, they didn't feel like they had air superiority over the areas that the Houthis controlled, meaning that like if they continued to send fighter jets over Yemen, that there was a fear that a jet would get shot down and that like American lives would be lost in this Yemen campaign, which Trump really didn't want. And like, it's not like the Houthis have state-of-the-art weaponry, right? Against this like massive, most technologically advanced army in the history of the earth, and somehow just an absolute disaster of a loss. At some point, Trump apparently met with the Defense Department and was like, tell us what you've succeeded in doing in Yemen. And the only thing that they said, like literally the only thing that they could come up with was how many bombs they dropped. Like that was the only statistic that they were able to provide about the impact that their 2-month bombing campaign had. So it just, and then the way that Trump just like really quickly sours on the whole thing is like, let's just stop. Let's just stop and claim victory. And that's basically what happened. And, in this Middle East Eye article, I think takes the New York Times information and removes the spin where you can see the sort of reality here that the US spent $1 billion bombing Yemen, but never gained air superiority, which is like, yeah, that's the real truth underlying the thing. In Lebanon, the broken ceasefire continues to be broken ever further. The Israelis are once again firing on the United Nations, while Trump's like new Middle East envoy is pushing for normalization with Lebanon and Syria, with Israel, obviously. Whether or not that can realistically happen in Lebanon seems doubtful, but in Syria, there has been a lot of weird movement. Just this week, of course, folks probably heard Trump announced that all sanctions were going to be lifted on Syria. Uh, it's a little odd here because Trump doesn't actually have the authority to do that. Like the sanctions weren't levied by the administration or even by past administrations. They were levied by Congress, right? There's this whole like Caesar Act. And so, he might be able to temporarily suspend the sanctions or something, but it's going to require an act of Congress to fully repeal them. And I suspect that the political appetite in Congress to repeal all sanctions on Syria is going to be a little low. But who knows? There's actually a lot to unpack here and why relieving sanctions is so important and its sort of like benefits and risks, but might save that for another time and just note that like, yeah, even this announcement that Trump's own Treasury Department had no idea that he was about to say that they were going to lift sanctions. But a key piece of this, is the drive to get Syria to normalize relations with Israel. And apparently, the Syrian government has said that they're open to normalize, under what they call the right circumstances, whatever that means. Trump's meeting with Ahmed al-Shara was also just extremely bizarre, where he called him a young and attractive man and referred to his strong past, which like, is that what we're calling it? We're just okay, sure. If you haven't seen that interview, you should. It's a riot. And then adding to our usual regional analysis, just wanted to touch in on the Gulf states really quick because obviously, that's where Trump has been all week. This drop site article, I feel like did a great job of really getting into the dynamics of that Trump visit and what it accomplished and what it didn't. But mostly, I think it's really valuable to read because it gets into the whole set of possible outcomes for Gaza, laying out like, okay, the United States could stop this right now. It could do nothing at all and let Israel continue its annihilation campaign. And then there's this possibility, this somewhat slim possibility for a third option, which is like a temporary truce that should be like the first step in a long-term ceasefire. And that's the only thing really that's on the table right now, I think, that could meaningfully lead to Israel stopping its campaign as it relates to, the US flexing its power. Um, I don't know that it's super likely, but it's also not unlikely given that there is a really strong incentive. I think, like Trump is pushing really hard, one, to get all of this like cash and bribes that he's getting from the Gulf countries, and two, the normalization of relations, like, the continuation of his Abraham Accords is something that he really wants. And I think he understands that Israel and the ongoing assault on Gaza is like a main impediment to that. So we are really clearly seeing a moment where the interests of Trump and Netanyahu are diverging. Whether the divergence is significant enough to lead to something that we would want to see is a different question. And I think some of the conversations that I've heard this past week about like, oh, Trump's gonna like recognize a Palestinian state and he's gonna force the Israelis to a ceasefire. I think those are overstated. And I don't think they're necessarily grounded in what Trump wants. Um, so yeah, I wouldn't hold my breath for that, but I do think that there is an opening here for a temporary truce that would lead to something. And Hamas has said specifically that they won't sign any temporary agreement unless there are very clear delineated pathways from that temporary truce into a long-term ceasefire. So if that happened, it would obviously be a significant development, but we'll see, I guess, whether the Edon Alexander hostage release gamble pays off in any sort of way. Here in the United States, we're seeing a few democratic reactions to what's happening in a way that, is a sort of positive development. And a thing that we talked about, I think, back in December, about how as the sort of political landscape changes, the calculus that Democrats are making, where they don't have to back Biden anymore, will allow them to speak out a little bit more on what's happening in Gaza. We're seeing it to some extent, obviously nowhere near where we want to see it, but there is a new push by Chris Murphy to block a $2 billion arms sale, uh, not to Israel, mind you, but to Qatar and I think the UAE, um, because of the plane that they offered to give Trump. So like the idea that like, oh, a foreign country can't bribe our president, but yeah, good luck with that. Meanwhile, a surprisingly large group of Senate Democrats are calling for food aid to get into Gaza and more or less directly saying that Israel is responsible for the food aid not getting in. So, again, a somewhat positive development there. But of course, friend of the show, Rashida Tlaib, is the one who really holds it down and introduced yesterday new legislation like she did the year before, recognizing the 77th anniversary of the Palestinian Nakba. And this one has had the most co-sponsors that a resolution like this has ever had in congressional history. So that's kind of exciting, including our own Bay Area Latifah Simon. So if you live in her district, please take a moment to shoot her a thank you email for this. It's important that we protect folks who are standing out and calling the genocide what it is. That really means something. I think that we shouldn't take for granted. And then, as always, wanted to spend just a little bit of time on the campus crackdowns. The This Guardian opinion article by this Harvard professor was fascinating to me because Harvard is sort of being held up right now as this paragon of resistance to Trump weaponizing anti-Semitism, yada yada. But at the same time, like they are very much attacking their own students for standing up for Palestine. They're just not okay with Trump dictating how they're going to do that, but they are nevertheless are doing it in full force. And so, Harvard last week, I think, put out a new anti-Semitism report. And in that anti-Semitism report, like the examples they gave of rampant campus anti-Semitism was this Israeli professor's class that touches on the like on peace building and talks about the Israeli-Palestinian conflict and includes like testimony of Israeli soldiers who like speak to atrocities that they committed. And so an Israeli professor quoting Israeli soldiers is now anti-Semitic, according to Harvard. Um, Meanwhile, here in California, we saw really unfortunately 2 days ago the Education Committee of the California State Assembly passing unanimously a new bill, AB 715, basically specifically designed to crack down on any Palestine speech at schools, right? So there's a long sort of trajectory of what happened here, but the short-ish version is that a bill designed to kill Palestine conversations and ethnic studies was successfully resisted by a really broad coalition of educators and community groups or whatever. And because that bill was going to die, um, it the same authors of that legislation, understanding that it was going to pass, basically gutted some existing bill and turned it into this new Frankenstein bill that um, basically puts the onus on schools to ensure that they don't have any curriculum that discriminates based on, among other things, national origin. So, like, if you say something that's offensive to Israel, that's apparently grounds for some, like whatever, the school board getting in trouble or teachers getting in trouble. Um, I and many other folks were at this hearing on Wednesday, and it was truly remarkable seeing massive community opposition um, to this bill, and like the authors talking about how they were trying to, protect against all the anti-Semitism rampant in the schools, and the majority of Jewish folks who were present that day spoke against the bill, and then representatives from both the California School Board Association and the Teachers Union. Think about how often those two groups get along. Both of them said this legislation, as written, is dangerous to school boards, it's dangerous to teachers and educators, and it's dangerous to students. To the point where like the public sort of the narrative around this had gotten so toxic that the members of the education committee were like, okay, yeah, I'm hearing that this bill has a lot of problems. But this is just the first step. It's just got to go through committee. It still has to go to the full vote. So I'm just going to pass it anyway. And they all did that unanimously, despite the fact that there had been no public hearings on this bill. There were no consultations with any other community groups. And teachers and school boards said it was poorly written. They were just like, yeah, fine. And they passed it anyway. This doesn't mean that the bill has become law. It has a very long road ahead, and it's going to be critical for us to kill this bill. Um, I, would really encourage folks to reach out to your state reps, your state assembly person. For those of you in San Francisco, for many of you, it's Matt Haney. I'm not sure who other people need to reach out to, but there are some petition tools out there that I'll be happy to link to that you should really make sure your voice is heard on this. There's another key piece about this, about how they're changing the definition for anti-Semitism, but we might come back to that if we have time. The other piece of the campus crackdowns that happened this week, of course, worth noting, Logan Rozos, as Thomas mentioned at the top, um, is having his diploma withheld because he's mentioned the genocide in his commencement speech. It was a beautiful video. I really recommend if you haven't seen it, give it a watch. The response from the administration is just bone-chillingly evil. Like apologizing for the community present having to hear his words, like, yeah, God forbid they have to hear the fact that a genocide is occurring. And then of course Bedr Khan Suri being released, a huge development, and like it's amazing to see these attempts at killing free speech and deportation backfiring so spectacularly on the Trump administration. And his words on this are really quite beautiful. So I do recommend checking out that post. Um, Real quick, just touching on the technology front. Uh, uh, this fascinating article in The Intercept this week about how about Google basically knew that the AI tools and like tech data storage stuff that they were providing the Israeli military would likely be used to commit crimes, and that they wouldn't have any control over um, how Israel would end up using them. And they hired a consultant to, sort of vet the risk here. And the consultant was like, yeah, you shouldn't be providing this stuff to the Israeli military. And then they did it anyway. Not super surprising. So once again, get off Google in every way that you can. And so, just to sum up, the this new plan for conquering Gaza and displacing all the Palestinians to Rafah seems maybe to be getting started. It's not super clear yet, but it looks like, they said they were waiting for Trump to leave, and Trump's about to leave. So, um, I wouldn't be surprised if it started in full force this weekend. And it's really critical, I think, for us to oppose that every way that we can. Meanwhile, I would say, there's a lot of talk this week about Trump unilaterally bringing about a ceasefire. I don't think those are based in, an assessment of like what Trump's own interests here are. So maybe a temporary truce will be coming sometime soon, but the recognition of the state of Palestine is not happening. I don't think anytime soon. I could be wrong. I'd love to be wrong. But yeah, we should, engage with the dynamics that we have. And there is room here, and I think there's real meaningful room to move Trump on some of this stuff. So, yeah, we should continue to press that. Meanwhile, I would say Democrats are increasingly forced to recognize the scale of what's happening in Gaza and, respond to the overwhelming number of their constituents that want them to stand up to this genocide, but they are still trying to dodge it. And so holding particularly your local Democratic legislators accountable, um, it has never been more critical. Like, so I really cannot recommend enough being in constant communication, particularly with your local legislators to the extent that you can. Like, hit up your, House rep and senators for sure, but also your state assembly person and your state senators. If your state senator is Scott Wiener, maybe don't bother. But if it's anybody else, it's really important, I think, to make your voice heard here. In terms of upcoming events, we got two big ones tomorrow. The Great Rite of Return is tomorrow morning, and then a large protest at 16th and Valencia, I think, should be happening tomorrow at 2:30 p.m. So I hope to see you there at both of those things. If you want to hear about any other events, you can go to bit.ly/Gaza events to check out AROC's calendar. If you would like text alerts, please text PSA to 833-633-0604. And you can always check out the PAL Media Tracker for articles that inform this analysis. You can sign up for a weekly digest at palmediatracker.com/sign up. And that's the end of it.